All right. Okay, we are good to go. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this program tonight. I hope that it will be a really sort of fun and interesting and hopefully even an enlightening program for us. I have to say the subject matter is very near and dear to my heart. I've always loved Norman Rockwell paintings. I think they're really fun to talk about with people. But I've had, I think, sort of a pleasant awakening about his philosophies and his personal politics over the past few years. So it was a real pleasure to put together this program, and I'm happy to share it with you tonight. So there's a lot of material. Typically, my programs last about an hour, and I'm aiming for that. So I might be talking a little fast at some points, and I will try and stop here and there to see if anybody has any burning questions. But otherwise, we can save some time for discussion at the end if you so desire. So let's just dive right in. We'll be looking at this incredible picture that's up on the screen right now a little bit more in depth later on in the program. But I wanted to start off with just the man of the hour, and that is Norman Rockwell. I wanted to give everybody a sense of who he was, when he was born, when he died. And I think these are all really good things to keep in mind as we're thinking about him in terms of his understanding of race in America. But of course, he is America's most beloved illustrator, and I mean, you could probably say the most beloved artist in many ways. And he had this incredible, almost 5-decade-long career with the Saturday Evening Post. And I'll be talking more about the Saturday Evening Post as a publication and its impact on America a little bit later, but what longevity with the institution. And so I think Americans in general tend to think of him as embodying or being able to sort of capture, reflect, and reinterpret American culture in this really powerful way. And so during this time at the Saturday Evening Post, he produced about 320 covers. And so these images, they resonated. I think they stay with us today. I think if you have kind of almost like a humorous or heartfelt experience with your own family, people tend to say like, oh, this is a Rockwell moment, even more so than this is a Saturday Evening Post moment. So he was a prolific artist, obviously very interested in detail, very interested in storytelling. And I think his legacy is one that is really profoundly connected to American culture, so much so that he was awarded that Presidential Medal of Freedom just before he passed away. So here he is in the photograph in his studio, and I just love the way he's sort of confronting us as the viewer. So the next image that I have here for you is one that I would say is a little atypical for Rockwell, but it's one that is fun to discuss. So if you've never seen this image before, or if it's been a while since you've seen it, I encourage you to lean in and look at some of these details. In a perfect world, we would have a full-blown conversation about this, but this is a painting that he did from 1959, and it's often called The Jury or The Holdout. So it's really fun to sort of take apart what exactly is happening in this picture. Clearly, this young woman is the one person who's holding out in this jury. She's holding up the whole process. You can see they've been there a while. There's all these ballots on the floor. There's cigarette smoke in the air. And it's this charged atmosphere where all of these men are leaning into her, trying to persuade her. And there's some significant, I think, kind of, they have a significant physical presence here. There's a sense of coercion happening. And I would say that this is an unusual image for Norman Rockwell because this is an image about justice. And we don't think of Norman Rockwell as being preoccupied with the justice system per se, or justice in America. We think of him as painting sweet images of kids and dogs and that sort of thing. So here we have something that is the very subject is justice, but there's also something else going on here. So this was painted about 2 years after the movie 12 Angry Men came out. So everybody, Americans already had this sense of like, oh yeah, jury holdout and that drama that can unfold in a jury's room. But what Norman Rockwell is also sort of commenting on here are the social politics, the fact that this is a woman. And when he painted this, in all across the United States, women did not have the right to serve on juries. Only in some states could they do that. So he was making a comment here, and of course he inserts himself in a very sort of forceful way in this picture, because his self-portrait here is hanging over this young woman's head. You have to love this young woman and how firm she seems in her resolve. So I just wanted to sort of touch on this idea of justice and how it sort of sneaks into Norman Rockwell's repertoire of work. So here is a quick overview of how we'll be moving through the material tonight. We're going to sort of skim across the idea of inclusion and exclusion. And then we're going to really look at this issue of race and how Norman Rockwell engaged with it over his career. But I do think that the issue of inclusion and exclusion is so important, because as we're looking at Norman Rockwell's work of something like this, which is Coming and Going from 1947, we have these depictions of the American family. Oftentimes he's using humor to tell a story that that people could really relate to. This is a middle-class family. They have middle-class income, and they have leisure time to take the day off on the weekend and strap their boat to their car and go to the beach. And it's the nuclear family. They even have grandma in the front here, or I'm sorry, in the back. And so we see the family literally heading off for a day away, and they're filled with excitement. It looks like 4 different kids in the car, at least, a dog, grandma, mom, and dad. And then we see them coming home at the end of the day, and they're all as deflated as this little girl's bubble, right? And then the joke here, of course, is that grandma looks the same from night to day. So, of course, everybody's supposed to have a little chuckle here, and they're supposed to see themselves in this picture to some degree. Let me tell you, as a mom of young children, I really identify with that mom napping on the way home. There's something in here that everybody can relate to. And Norman Rockwell wasn't afraid to show families in sort of tense moments, or maybe not at their best moments. This is Easter morning from 1959. And so we see the family all dressed up, heading out to church. And of course, Dad is still in his pajamas, and he's slinking down in the chair as though nobody knows that he's there, but to get out of going to church. And I love this little sidelong glance from the young boy here, who clearly wishes that maybe he could stay home with Dad. And of course, every family has these moments like this, whether you're getting out of going to a family obligation or church or something like this. We can all relate to this feeling in some way. But what Norman Rockwell was really good at when it came to this idea of inclusion is a homecoming scene. Man, was he good at homecomings. So this is December 25th, 1948. And this is Norman Rockwell's own family. This is his self-portrait here again at the top. He was friends with Grandma Moses, so he included this other artist in the picture as well. But the spotlight of this picture is the young man who's returned home, presumably from college or from new career at a far off city. And the entire family, we see their expressions, not his. We see the light in welcoming this young man home. And because there's almost always this, this humorous touch here, we see that he's brought home a bag of dirty laundry, right? So, but we can all connect with that feeling of welcoming home somebody that we've missed so much. So Norman Rockwell can create this scene that we as viewers can immediately connect to. And isn't it so interesting that for a Christmas cover, there's hardly any real references to Christmas. You can see, the Christmas tree in the top right corner, a few presents under his arm, but it's really about these personal human connections, these familial connections here. And then of course, you can't talk about the sense of inclusion without talking about this image. And we'll be delving into the 4 freedoms a little bit more later on. But this image is such an iconic Norman Rockwell image. And And we see, you know, a family gathering around a table for a holiday meal and multiple generations, a matriarch and a patriarch at the head of the table, and everyone just seems so delighted by the company. I mean, you'll notice that they're not even looking at the food here. The focus is those connections. And then what Norman Rockwell brilliantly does here is he includes this face in the bottom right, looking out at us and inviting us to the table here. So this is really a picture that's about middle-class America, and it's about that sense of we are all sharing in the prosperity of middle-class America in 1943 when this was created. Of course, in recent years, you have artists who are going back to Norman Rockwell's iconic works and reinterpreting them with a wider cast of characters, a more diverse cast of characters, to sort of say, you know, the prosperity that America has, it really, let's lengthen the table, let's welcome more people to the table, because this should be including more people. And I think we'll probably finish up tonight sort of thinking about how Norman Rockwell would think of these reinterpretations that are happening today. So let's turn our attention to what exclusion looks like. So an artist who's so good at making us feel like we're a part of America, that we all have these things in common. What does exclusion look like for him? He painted a lot of scenes of lonely people, of people in sort of dead-end jobs. So this is clearly an older man who's sitting at a ticketing booth for you know, people to purchase a ticket to travel, and he is literally locked inside this cage, can't go anywhere. And he shows people feeling this way at, you know, every stage of their life. The young coat check girl who just looks like she is dreaming of a life other than the one that she is in. And of course, all of us have been there. All of us have probably had a job that we didn't like at some point. But this isn't necessarily the picture that's supposed to make you giggle. This is the picture where it kind of pulls on your heartstrings in a different way. You still identify with it, but it's not as light and as cheerful as what we'd seen before. Just a few more images like this, just to show that Norman Rockwell was just really smart about capturing these poignant moments that are sort of universally felt. Skiers on a Train from 1962. This one always reminds me of the movie White Christmas, but we see all of these people just so jubilant to go on a skiing holiday. And then this one gentleman who is so clearly not part of the party, looking so uncomfortable in this moment as he's kind of overwhelmed by all these friends sharing this good time here. And then another picture, I have friends that have told me that this one really resonates with them too. This is from 1964, and it's generally referred to as Girl Looking Downstairs at a Christmas Party. This was a cover that he did for McCall's. And I think, again, this is another sort of universally felt experience or emotion where we're on the outside looking in. We're wondering when we can be a part of something that seems so foreign and so distant. And Norman Rockwell can make us all feel like a kid again so easily, right? So one last picture of exclusion before we move on and relate this over to race is this one here. This one's called The Soda Jerk from 1953. This is actually Norman Rockwell's, one of his sons posed as the Soda Jerk. And here he is involved in some very intense flirting and eye contact with at least two of these three girls. And he loves to include a dog to kind of reinforce that theme of love. But for me, understanding this picture always comes down to this lonely boy up in the top left and the way he's sort of looking on, and you can just feel his sense of why can't I be involved in something like this? You can feel his loneliness there. So here we have Norman Rockwell, who's so good at understanding and capturing these very poignant feelings of being on the outside. And he's so good at making Americans feel connected. So you have to wonder, why didn't this translate for him to depicting more of what was actually happening in America, because certainly America was not just white middle class America when ever, but particularly not in the 1940s and 50s and 60s when he was sort of at the height of his career. So let's turn our attention here to the Saturday Evening Post, and this is another one of Norman Rockwell's covers from 1941. It's a great cover here. So just a few sort of, I think, kind of need to know facts about the Saturday Evening Post. In the 1950s and 60s, it had a circulation upwards of 6 million copies a week. So, so this was something that was just pervasive in the culture. And for decades, the Saturday Evening Post had been aiming to be not a regional publication, which was more the norm at the beginning of the 20th century. They wanted to be a national publication. They wanted to speak to a national audience, and it was very important to them that their covers spoke to a national audience. So artists like Rockwell were carefully guided to create images that were relatable, that were funny, that were somewhat aspirational, like the one that you see here. And they focused on the lives of the daily lives of America's growing middle class, but really, for the most part, the white middle class. So I can't overstate how pervasive these images were. So even if you weren't buying one of these magazines, you probably saw it on the newsstand. If you did buy it, it probably sat in a prominent place in your house, on a coffee table, on a dining room table, and you really absorbed these images. You soaked up these images over the course of the week. So the story that Norman Rockwell tells in each of these images, it's layered, it's detailed, and it sort of unfolds over time. You can sort of quickly understand what's happening here, but then you can really spend time and appreciate these details. So, so what he was doing here and what the Saturday Evening Post was doing here was sort of simultaneously reflecting and defining American culture. So how did that play out in terms of race? Let's see here. Bear with me a moment. Here we go. All right. So I want to sort of quickly say that that for the most part, we'll be seeing a predominantly sort of white interpretation of middle-class America on the Saturday Evening Post. And I wanted to quickly share these images to show you that other national publications during this time period were not skirting the issue of race in America. They were featuring Black celebrities, they were featuring boundary breakers, they were even talking about segregation in a way that wasn't really happening in the Saturday Evening Post. And this is probably why. This is a quote from Norman Rockwell, and he said, "The Saturday Evening Post editor, who is a very liberal man, told me never to show colored people except as servants." So Norman Rockwell actually experienced with the Saturday Evening Post, he talked about this later in his life in an interview, that he was asked to actually paint out Black people in a group picture for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. So knowing that this was the policy, I want to give you sort of a glance at what the covers looked like when they did include Black people or references to Black people. So the next few images I'm going to show you are not by Norman Rockwell, but they're just to give you a sense in terms of what the landscape looked like in this sort of, you know, mass media a taste of the 1930s through the 50s here. So this is a 1930s cover by Lawrence Toney, and what we're seeing here are white men in blackface dancing as minstrels. So of course this is, you know, this in today's world, this would be considered abhorrent behavior, and this was probably sort of certainly on the decline of the popularity of minstrel shows, but certainly towing the line in terms of sort of what was even considered appropriate at the time. And then in 1934, you have J.C. Lyondecker, and he was sort of a precursor to Norman Rockwell. He was really Norman Rockwell learned a lot about him in terms of his compositions. So in 1934, in this picture called End of Vacation, we've got this beautiful, slender white woman who sort of looks like a starlet, who looks like she's kind of exiting, wherever she vacations. She's got this huge bouquet of flowers, and she seems sort of light and airy. And then just behind her, from our perspective, but walking alongside her, is a black porter who is carrying all of her heavy bags and even her golf clubs. And if you look at the composition here, we've got this interesting V shape between them, and it's sort of this wedge that that really speaks to the difference, the real differences for Black people and white people in America in the 1930s and 40s. And here, another picture by the same artist, a July 4th cover where we see two little boys who have climbed a light post in order to get a better view of a passing 4th of July parade. And again, we see a real disparity in terms of the way these boys are living. This little white boy is wearing, nice clothes. He's well positioned on this flagpole. He's sort of signaling triumphantly to the people down below. And the little black boy here is wearing threadbare clothes. He's hanging on for dear life to the flagpole. And it looks as though his face is looking downwards with concern that he could fall here. So just a few more images just to kind of reinforce the pattern here. The mammy type became a very popular subject on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in the 1930s and in the early 1940s. So here we have cooking up a story on the right with a Black woman who's in the process of cooking, but also sort of talking to or kind of teaching a young white boy who's sitting at her feet. And then we have Scrubbing the Floor from 1939. And so we're beginning to see the proliferation of the mammy type. And it's this really kind of one-dimensional depiction of Black women. They're heavy set, they're relegated to the domestic sphere, and whether it's their home or the home of a white family where they might work. And J.C. Lyondecker, this same artist that we've been seeing a little bit of, he could sometimes be an equal opportunity offender when it comes to depicting Black and white people. And here what we're looking at is a picture of a white woman who is in many ways kind of represented in the same visual coded language that we see the mammy represented as. She's heavy set, her hair is covered, she's surrounded by tools for cleaning, and just to poke a little bit more fun at her, J.C. Lindecker has put her on a little pedestal here at the bottom, and if you have really good eyes, you might see that the label here is Queen of the May. So of course, this woman is not a beauty queen. She's getting ready for spring cleaning. and I will say it was pretty unusual for the Saturday Evening Post artists to poke fun at middle-class white women like this. For the most part, even if they were in a comical situation, like the one that we see on the right, the middle-class white woman is still beautiful and slender and has the sense of elegance to her, even if her home is falling apart. So in the next few years, again, there's more mammies here. This is J.C. Lindecker again on the left, and another artist named Miriam Troop on the right. So this is Basting the Turkey. It's a Thanksgiving cover from 1936, and then Rain on Laundry Day from 1940. And so again, we see that the visual language of communicating the mammy type is very much encoded here. I mean, their outfits are nearly identical, and of course their activities are really very narrowly focused. And then the last mammy I wanted to show you very quickly is from 1941, and this is such a strange image to me. I think it might have more to do with the oncoming of World War II more than anything, but this is called Sweep It Under the Rug. And this is from May 1941. So it's pretty rare for the Saturday Evening Post to have a cover where there's a Black background like this. And there's just something so sort of strange and sinister about this particular depiction. But of course, what we're seeing is sort of a dishonest activity from a domestic domestic servant who's, you know, instead of getting rid of dirt, she's sweeping it under the rug sort of surreptitiously. And so again, a sort of unflattering type being perpetuated. And of course, that type was perpetuated in all kinds of media at this time. So you have Gone with the Wind, which came out in 1939. And of course, everybody's like, well, Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar for that role. But of course, I mean, it was a role that it was kind of the only role that America would be willing to see a Black woman in at this time. And I should mention, I think it was more than 50 years, took more than 50 years before another woman won an Oscar for the best supporting role in a movie. So, so just to hit that nail on the head one last time, I think most of us are probably familiar with the book or the movie The Help, which sort of is kind of a modern re-examination of these kind of civil rights era relationships between women, Black and white. And the movie featured some of the best Black actresses alive today. And Viola Davis, who you see in the picture on the right, she's on the right, she talked later about how she really regretted taking on that role because she said it wasn't the voices of the maids that were heard. So, so it's still a very tricky, sort of interesting issue in our culture today, but we're here for Norman Rockwell. So let's go back to Rockwell. So Norman Rockwell makes really interesting artistic choices throughout his entire career. So we're going to start off with his decisions to include African Americans in his artwork from early on. And so I've sort of scoured his body of work the best I can. And the earliest depiction I could find is this one here. And this is a very early painting. I believe it dates to the 1920s. I don't have that handy at the moment. And what we're looking at here is actually an advertisement that he did that was in the Saturday Evening Post, but it's an advertisement, and I bet nobody would guess if I quizzed you right now. What do you think this is an advertisement for? It's actually an advertisement for floor polish. So what's happening in this picture? Why did Norman Rockwell decide to include a banjo player? Well, it almost looks as though we're in an upper class household, and you almost get the sense of like an itinerant musician who's been welcomed in. They've rolled the carpet back so that this young boy, this young white boy, can kind of beat along sort of a percussion rhythm on this beautifully varnished floor to accompany this older gentleman who's, again, sort of in these threadbare clothes. And if you're familiar with the history of the banjo, it's essentially a musical instrument with roots in all different parts of Africa. And then it was kind of, it wasn't brought over per se from Africa through the slave trade, but it was kind of reinvented and reimagined in America by slaves. And then it became reinvented as a racist stereotype in the 1800s. So you had Black minstrel groups, particularly in the earlier part of the 1800s, and then by the early 1900s, you had white people in blackface play acting at being Black and performing the banjo. So it's a very sort of racially coded instrument, and it has this long history. There's great texts about the history of banjos. There is this remarkable painting that kind of stands out in the history of art. It's from 1893. So it would have been painted right around the time that Norman Rockwell was born. Who knows if he ever saw it, but it was painted by an African-American artist. And it stands out because instead of sort of saying that African-Americans have this kind of natural ability in terms of banjo playing, this is showing that it's a skill that's passed down lovingly from one generation to another. So Norman Rockwell's decision to depict an African-American playing a banjo is very much rooted in kind of these old racial stereotypes. I wanted to show you what he did for covers of the Saturday Evening Post as well, knowing that they had this particular policy. So he is interested in including them in his pictures, and sometimes he's sort of trying to kind of skirt the rules, or surprise his viewers, I think, too. So the image on the left is called "He Went That Way" from 1934. So we have kind of this fancy upper class woman who's been thrown from her horse. Oh, the indignities. And she doesn't even know where the horse is. And we have what seems like a poor young Black boy who is adding to the indignity by showing her where her horse has actually run off to. So of course we see him from behind, he's faceless, he's anonymous here. And then in the image on the right, we have Full Treatment from 1940. And I had to look at this picture several times before I realized that there was an African-American in this picture, but he's on his knees. Again, we see him from behind, he's faceless. There's a middle-class white man who's getting the full treatment here. Being pampered, and this young African American who you can see again has a hole in the bottom of his shoe, is busy polishing the shoes of the white man here. So so knowing all of this is sort of where things began for Norman Rockwell, but his views begin to evolve, and we'll be looking at this image a little bit more in depth in just a moment. But I want to share with you what Norman Rockwell actually said on this issue. And he said, "I was born a white Protestant with some prejudices, which I'm continuously trying to eradicate." So I think, to use the parlance of our times, Norman Rockwell would have considered himself an anti-racist. And he started feeling this way sort of surprisingly early on in his career. And we begin to see a real sort of earnest desire to want to include people of all faiths and all colors in his artwork. He felt so strongly about this about this particular issue that he became estranged from some of his family members because of their racist perspectives, which I know today a lot of people are struggling with that issue too. So I wanted to show you how he made strides to be able to find work where he could depict people who looked different than the average person on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And the image that we're looking at here is sort of Norman Rockwell, because it doesn't necessarily a heartwarming tale of America. This is fiction of a story that was published in American Magazine in 1936 that was called Love Wango, which is basically like love voodoo. And what we're seeing here is kind of the clash of a city woman and country folk. And so we have this beautiful city woman here who has gone to this country church because she is trying to find someone to essentially cast a love spell. And so there's this interest and suspicion among the country folk about this kind of beautifully dressed young woman who's sitting in the pews. And I think it was Norman Rockwell's granddaughter who said that this woman in that orange dress is probably one of the most beautiful women that Norman Rockwell ever painted. And of course, we don't see it that much, but it doesn't really line up with these bigger ideas of who we are as Americans. So around this time, this is painted in 1940, this image. And again, it's an illustration for another short story in the American Magazine. Around this time, Norman Rockwell moves to Vermont, which is the whitest state in the country. And he loses access to kind of a broader cast of characters that he could have used as models. So he really worked very hard to seek out models to work with so that his paintings could accurately depict or accurately capture just what he was seeking to capture, and in this case, to illustrate the story. And the story that's taking place here is really about this little white boy who wants to keep these two dogs. His parents say he can't, and so this little black boy says he'll take care of the dogs if the little white boy gives him his watch. So it's this moment where he has to give up the dogs and the watch. So the stories themselves really aren't that important, but it's interesting to know that Norman Rockwell was kind of going out of his way to find these opportunities to depict more people of color. And then you come up to we're in the 1940s, and then you come up to his most famous series here, which is The Four Freedoms. And these are images that we're probably all very well familiar with. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is the second image here from the left, which is the freedom of worship, or the freedom of religion here. So we have the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and then freedom from fear. And if you look at them as a series, you can probably see that, that the freedom of religion image is really different from the other pictures. And the other ones kind of tell a little story, and you've got characters who are kind of interacting with each other. But then when it comes to the freedom of religion, there's less color to it and less of a story. We just have these very large faces, these very detailed hands, a very compressed scene where it feels like these bodies are kind of pressed together, and everybody is in this moment of prayer. And what Norman Rockwell had originally conceived for this picture, something that was very important to him from the get-go, was to not only show religious freedom, but to show racial tolerance. And so his original conception here was a barber shop where you'd have people of different faiths coming together. And so, obviously a Catholic priest over here, maybe a Protestant over here. I think the gentleman in the barber shop chair was supposed to be Jewish, and then just cut off in at least this draft, this version, was a Black man walking through the door. Norman Rockwell ultimately felt that this depiction relied way too heavily on stereotypes, so he ultimately abandoned it, which is why we have, I think, a more simplified rendition of what freedom of religion really looks like. But importantly, he still included people of different skin tones and different faiths in this picture. And that was very much subverting the rules for the Saturday Evening Post. And these images were published in the Saturday Evening Post. But I think it's sort of hard to argue against it when these images as a whole make such a powerful statement. So continuing on with the 1940s and continuing on with this idea that Norman Rockwell's views are kind of evolving. And I think even today, as we talk about being anti-racist, what that really means is that you're not suddenly magically no longer racist. It's that you're making concerted efforts to not be racist. And for Norman Rockwell, this wasn't necessarily a straight line, but I think a lot of his pictures show incredible progress in this direction. So, I love this image. It's a homecoming scene of a soldier from World War II. This is 1945. The whole community is welcoming him back. We see him from behind. We project ourselves into his shoes, and we imagine just how good it feels to be welcomed back by all of your loved ones, all of your neighbors, even your little sweetheart hiding out here around the corner. Look at how happy the dog is. The dog isn't even touching the ground, the dog's flying. But importantly, in this picture with everybody spilling out of these windows, peeking over the fence, we have these two boys up in the tree here. Norman Rockwell had gone to a specific community to document what the tenement houses looked like. And while he was there, he saw little black boys and little white boys playing together, and he was committed to depicting that in this picture. And so we've come a ways since J.C. Lyondecker's picture from the previous decade, where we had two boys on a street lamp, and their social status, their positioning in American culture was really being very overt in this picture. And here, Norman Rockwell is showing, he's put the black child above the white child, and he's just showing kids playing as he saw them in real life. And so to me, there's something really nice and heartwarming about that. Now, there was a story of national news that I have to share with you, and this is just from the following year, from 1946. And this is a story that kind of hit home for Norman Rockwell in particular. So this was a story that unfolded at the University of Vermont. And the young woman that you see in the magazine article here on the left, her name is Crystal Malone, while she was at UVM. And she was the only Black girl who would have been in that sorority. And the head of the national organization for the sorority drove right up to Vermont from Washington and begged her not to do it. And ultimately, the girls of the sorority said, well, you know, we're not going to be a sorority without Crystal. And so they really kind of rallied for her, and they asked for support from even the university president. And he came out with a statement that seemed pretty wishy-washy. And it got a national response. People were writing in letters to the president of the University of Vermont. And ultimately, Norman Rockwell was one of the people who wrote to the head of the University of Vermont about this issue. And he essentially said, you got to go support those girls and make sure that Crystal Malone can be a part of this. Ultimately, the girls burned their charter for the sorority because they wouldn't allow the sorority to be integrated. And just as a footnote to that, they didn't apologize to Crystal Malone about that until 2008. So Norman Rockwell felt really passionately about these issues. This is 1946 and he's writing letters. So, continuing on, the mid-1940s, Norman Rockwell is asked to paint the first 4th of July cover for the Saturday Evening Post following the end of the World War II. So they knew that they wanted it to be, to feature the Statue of Liberty, and here are some other images that had been of the Statue of Liberty that had been on the cover of the Post. And so Norman Rockwell's sort of thinking about, how do I do this differently? And this is an early sketch where he was sort of thinking, oh, well, I can show all types of people kind of gathering here at the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. And then ultimately he thought, why don't I depict the people that clean the Statue of Liberty? And he contacted the organization that runs the statue, and they even gave him some photographs that Norman Rockwell could work from. And so he comes up with a very different idea for how to show the Statue of Liberty after World War II. So of course, it's not the full view of the statue. And instead he's focused on the torch, which is the real symbol of liberty here. And he's also focused on the physical labor of 5 individuals who are cleaning the statue. And the people that actually do this are, you know, somewhere, I think, 300 feet off of the ground. And for Norman Rockwell, it was really important to include an African-American man participating in this act of, in this kind of significant act of cleaning the torch. And I believe this is like heavy leaded amber here. So the torch is literally America lighting the way forward, freedom, peace, prosperity, post-war. And Norman Rockwell saying, well, it's not just white America that's involved in doing that. Amazingly, somehow this African American character was overlooked or not noticed, went unnoticed for quite some time. And I think about a decade ago, there was a researcher who brought up the fact that there is an African American in this picture, and mentioned it, I think, to the director of the Norman Rockwell Museum, who looked at it and just said, wow, he's not supposed to be there. So this picture is actually in the collection of the White House, and was hung in the Oval Office for quite some time. And then I think once they understood the significance of that character included there, you can see that they kind of rearranged some of the objects on view and placed it right over a sculptural bust of Martin Luther King Jr. So there was a real understanding and appreciation, not just for the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty there, but for the inclusion of an African American too. So, you know, we're running a little bit long here, so I'm trying to go really quick. All right, so Norman Rockwell continued to try and fight for the ability to include people of color in his works, particularly in the 1940s and 50s. The work that we're looking at here is from 1946, and it's called Boy in a Dining Car. Norman Rockwell's own son posed as the little boy. And then you have this really interesting character of the porter here. And I just wanted to zoom in on his face, because I think you can read his facial expression in a lot of different ways. The Pullman porters were, that was a great job to have if you were an African American male. You made great money, mostly on tips. Pullman porters are sort of credited as starting the African American middle class, but you were sort of treated the worst on the train while you were doing this job. So if you compare this to images of other porters that other Saturday Evening Post illustrators were creating, you can see, compared to J.C. Lyondecker from 1937, that this porter is in a much more subservient role. And the power and the authority of this young white child seems in no doubt. And then when we go back to Norman Rockwell, again, there's this sort of interesting expression on this gentleman's face, and you have to wonder what's going through his mind as he looks at this young boy who's trying to calculate exactly how much he should pay for the food that he's ordering here. So there's I don't know, a sense of benevolence there. There's some kindness, but maybe like a little bit of weariness there too. So our next segment here is a new stance. And Norman Rockwell had been bristling for quite some time by the rules established by the Saturday Evening Post. And here's a photograph of him in his studio. Seemingly overnight in 1953, he moved from Vermont to Stockbridge, Massachusetts with his wife so that she could get better care or more immediate care for mental health issues. And it was around this time too that Norman Rockwell was feeling pretty depressed, and he began to see a counselor too. And one of the things he sort of credited or cited as being an issue in his life was that he had the desire to do something important. And this was really grating on him. And it would be really probably 10 years before he took a major step. But very quickly, I wanted to show you how throughout the 50s, he was still finding ways to sort of honestly include depictions of people of color. So this is such a charming picture of his. It's called Roadblock from the 1950s. We see a truck and a neighborhood that has come to a standstill. This is such a complicated image that he's created. He was inspired to do it while he was out in California. And the entire composition is really focused down on this little dog here. There's dozens of characters, and Norman Rockwell significantly includes right down at the bottom these two young children. And again, we see them from behind. They're sort of anonymous, but they've got this prominent placement in this complicated composition that he's created here. And for him, again, it's, you know, he'd go and he'd look at communities that look like this, and he said they belong there. That's the truth. So then we have his kind of slow departure from the Saturday Evening Post. So this is his triple self-portrait from 1960, and we see by this time the Saturday Evening Post is publishing things like America's Best Loved Artist Finally Tells His Own Story. He was in some ways almost like their cash cow. This was a hard relationship to break, but ultimately he decided he needed to leave the Saturday Evening Post because he couldn't tell the stories he was looking to tell. So this is from the following year. This is from 1961. The Post had loosened the rules somewhat because they were kind of sensing that Norman Rockwell was ready to go. And this is one of his most powerful works. And this is as diverse as you could get. And imagine him out in Western Mass trying to find, you know, all the different models to pose for him. But the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, I wish this was just something that we all went back to repeatedly. And it seems so simple, so sweet, not necessarily profound, but like an important message. But it's really important for us to remember that when he painted this, many Americans felt you do unto others that look like you. And so this was still kind of a scandalous statement for him to make with a diverse cast of characters here. So his emphasis was obviously kindness and respect. So he says when he departs finally, the Saturday Evening Post, for 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. Grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time. So then what does he do? 1963, he goes and he joins the NAACP. This is a man on a mission, and he is really dedicated to telling new stories. So that counselor that I had mentioned before really helped him and said, I am connected to a counselor down in Louisiana who's been working with this issue of desegregation, and you should know this story of Ruby Bridges. And so Norman Rockwell was inspired to create this picture, which is called The Problem We All Live With. It's from 1963-64. And this is an incredible depiction of the desegregation of a New Orleans school by a little six-year-old girl named Ruby Bridges. She was the only Black child to attend that school for the entire year, and for the entire year, she was escorted in and out by U.S. Marshals. And so Norman Rockwell, ever the storyteller, is thinking, how do I tell this story? And of course, I think many of us are familiar with the photographs of Ruby Bridges being escorted in and out of her school, just, this tiny little child. And the images that most people don't see as much of are the people that were there that she had to be protected from. And that was an angry mob of moms, dads, brothers, who were so angry that this little girl was attending this school. I mean, they were even carrying around, a doll in a coffin, and with just, these horrific signs here too. So we're going to get back to this image in just a second, but when it was published, there was a real sort of mix in terms of the reaction. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but I want to share with you this letter in particular. Dear Mr. Rockwell, I've never written to a national figure before, nor do I intend to make a habit of it now. Allow me to say that I have never been so deeply moved by any picture as by your painting in the current issue of Look magazine. Thank you for showing this white Southerner how ridiculous he looks. The truth is pretty hard to take until we get it from a Norman Rockwell. So, I mean, talk about art changing minds. So Norman Rockwell, he sought out several models to help pose as Ruby Bridges. And so you can see here with the photographs, he always worked from photographs. He was very particular in trying to capture a specific pose here. And then he had the challenge of knowing that this would be a spread across the magazine. And so there would be this kind of gutter in the middle. So Ruby couldn't be in the middle of the picture. She kind of either had to be in the front or the back. And so in this early draft here, you can see that he's kind of playing around with this idea of where she could be. I like the ultimate choice that he made here, where it looks like she has just been missed, and there's that, there's the implied, well, there's the actual violence of that tomato, and then the suggestion of red and blood and violence there beyond it. There's the hateful graffiti in the background, and then there's this strong, powerful presence of the marshals there, and then just the absolute, almost devastating innocence of this child. President Obama asked to have this painting on view at the White House to celebrate just the 50th anniversary of the integration of schools. So here he is looking at Norman Rockwell's painting, and the woman standing next to him is Ruby Bridges. And there's a really incredible video of him talking with her about this painting. And he turns to her and says, I wouldn't be where I am now if you weren't there going through that. So it's pretty amazing I think everybody's always amazed to see how young Ruby Bridges still is, how recent this history is. But I want to connect this back to that feeling of being on the outside, that feeling of exclusion. And that was something that Norman Rockwell was able to capture and had inside of him all along. And so these stories of these stories from the civil rights movement were his opportunity to take that and leap forward in terms of his storytelling. Because you look at this and you can't help, your heart can't help but to go out to Ruby Bridges and to feel exactly, or to imagine exactly what she was feeling as she as she faced the mob every day just to go to school. So just a few more images that Norman Rockwell painted from the civil rights era. This one's called Southern Justice. He was inspired to create this after he heard about the murder of 3 civil rights workers. This is one of his darkest paintings that he'd ever painted. And you can see in an earlier draft, he had included the law enforcement officers that were implicated in the crime. In the final work over here on the left, which is kind of this dark monochromatic image, we just see the victims. Norman Rockwell ever committed to realism. We see here the staging of this picture in his studio, and then Norman Rockwell actually wearing the white shirt and kind of modeling how the blood on the hand would be transferred to that white shirt. He continued on creating works for Look magazine and other publications during the 1960s. This is an illustration that he did for an article written by Sergeant Shriver that says, "How goes the war on poverty?" And of course, Norman Rockwell's image here includes faces of all different colors of Americans. And then one of his last and best known images from this era of his career is this one here. Really interesting painting from 1967 called The New Kids on the Block, or The New Kids in the Neighborhood. And so we have a Black family moving into what we assume is probably a white neighborhood. And it's this moment of sort of interest, skepticism, distrust as these children sort of come together. And they're, immediate signifiers here, like dogs and cats. We imagine, will they get along? But then there's, the more time you spend with this, you see little details like the fact that both of these little boys have baseball gloves. And you can imagine that in a short amount of time, they could easily be playing together. Norman Rockwell uses this yellow color to kind of move our eye around this picture. And as your eye is moving around, if you have really good eyes, you can even see a very suspicious neighbor peeking out of the window, very skeptical about this new family moving in. So here's just Norman Rockwell working with the models for this picture, getting them into those exact right poses, because I think you can read so much into the posture of every single child in that picture. We could obviously spend an hour talking about it. And then there are modern takes on this image as well. And this is a mural in New Orleans where an artist is showing sort of white kids moving into a Black neighborhood, that same kind of suspicion, but in this case, they both have soccer balls. And then I want to connect this picture back to that idea of inclusion and how Norman Rockwell is so good at creating something that we can all sort of connect to in some way. And I think when we look at the New Kids on the Block, we immediately think of how we would feel as a child, either new to the neighborhood or wondering about the new kids in the neighborhood. So it doesn't quite wrap its arms around us the same way some of his other paintings do, but I think it's something that he was particularly proud of. And I love how serious he is in this photograph of himself with the painting. And I think it's worth noting that he was 70 years old when he painted it. He was getting radical in his old age. And really the last most important picture that sort of speaks to his evolving views on race is this one here, which you almost never see reproduced. This is Norman Rockwell painting people questioning their government. This is called The Right to Know. It was published in Look magazine in 1968. This is again, sort of a very diverse view of America, questioning, asking their government for transparency during the course of the civil rights movement, during the course of Vietnam. So, and you have somebody in this, you know, everybody is supposed to be able to relate to somebody in this picture, and Norman Rockwell includes himself in this image as well. So at the very end of his career, he's asked to paint the cover for the July 4th bicentennial issue of American Artist magazine. He's 82 years old at this point. Clearly his ability to do the detail work is not as refined as it was towards the beginning of his career. And I think it's so, it speaks volumes that he chose to depict himself with the Liberty Bell, because to him, obviously it represents America, it's on a human scale, but it's also flawed. And I think Norman Rockwell certainly loved America, but he saw it for warts and all. And so we know in the last few years of his career, he was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. He passed away in 1978. And if you looked at the Saturday Evening Post from the following year, you would never guess in a million years that there was any strife in the relationship there, because he's certainly being honored as a hero. But I think what I'll do is I will finish up tonight with this image here, because there are so many artists who are working today who are revisiting these kind of iconic images that Norman Rockwell created for us, 70 plus years ago at this point, and sort of reimagining them as representing a more diverse America. And this is just one slice of an artist doing that. There's actually a lot of artists who are doing this. And I have to say, just based on what Norman Rockwell painted and his few statements on the subject, you'd have to believe that he would be really proud of these images. And if he felt like he could have painted the world this way in the 1940s and in the 1950s, he probably would have tried. So we'll end there for now. Thank you so much for your attention and your interest in the subject. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. And I will also finally check the chat too. I saw that there's a few chats there. Yeah. Any questions? All right, well then I've covered it all.
I have a question.
Sure.
And the question is, would you consider him more an artist or an illustrator?
I think he always identified himself as an illustrator. I think more and more art historians are starting to appreciate him as a fine artist these days. And in some ways, it's not even a significant difference, because there's so much here to talk about. And I think a lot of art historians today want to sort of take up issues where it's kind of fine art reflected in popular culture, or vice versa anyways.
Yeah.
I think that's juicy stuff that everybody can sink their teeth into. So he would call himself an illustrator, but I think I would say there's kind of more to his work than meets the eye. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add to that? Hi, Jane, it's Inez.
Hi.
I've done some work on Rockwell as well, and his autobiography, if anyone's interested in it, it's called My Life as an Illustrator. And he talks about the fact that he defined himself as an illustrator because he didn't feel that he was equal to those great artists of the past or present. But Jane, I think you're right. And I'm a generation or two older than you, but we never studied Norman Rockwell in graduate. And it's so great to see him considered now along with some of the great artists, because I think you're right. I think a lot of looking again at his work, he was certainly, I would say, a great artist and had a lot to say.
Yeah, I agree. I remember back, 20 plus years ago when I was in college, I remember the first time I saw like a Vanity Fair article where they were dissecting and diagramming his paintings in the same way that we were doing with Rembrandt paintings in college, so I was like, oh, there's definitely something going on here. So I've always had an interest. Yeah.
I wanted to just comment quickly, Jane. I cannot thank you enough. I've been to the museum 3 times. I love it so much. And it just gave me the chills because all of these great things are there out in his Stockbridge. And when you go there and you see all the covers framed and they're all the way around their room, it's like taking a history class.
Yeah.
It's so phenomenal. And I just loved this presentation. Kudos. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And
I loved it.
Feel like this is a dimension of his work that I don't think is talked about as much. I think we all sort of appreciate the humorous stuff or the warm-hearted stuff, and there was more to him than that. And I loved discovering this part of who he was too.
Yes, and the docents at the museum do touch on many of these things.
Oh,
they great. Take if you do the tour thing, they do. It's really worth driving out there.
Absolutely.
Must see. Thank you.
Any other questions for Jane?
All right.
I guess not. Well, I just want to thank you, Jane, so much and remind everyone that our next event will be on August 18th. And I put the link to register in the chat, and I'll also do a follow-up email so everyone has the link.
All right.
Thank you, Jane.
Everyone. Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Bravo.